Okay, so welcome everyone who's joining us this evening, wherever you're joining us from. This evening we've got a screening and a panel discussion around the film High Heels Aren't Compulsory. When I sat down with Joe around about February this year, this isn't the kind of event that we planned. However, we've got it going online and we hope that you enjoy being with us for 2 hours this evening. In a moment, I'm going to introduce each of the panel members. As I do that, feel free to use the chat to say hello and to say where you're watching from this evening. The Q&A is open for you to do that as we're watching. So why are we doing this and why are we doing this at the moment? Well, in the moment, we're in the middle of Transgender Awareness Week. And that's a week in November when transgender people and their allies will try to take actions to bring attention to the community by educating the public around who transgender people are, sharing their stories, their experiences, and doing some advocacy around the prejudice and the discrimination that still exists across the world and affects the transgender community. So right at the moment, we're right in the middle of Transgender Awareness Week. And on Friday, there is the Transgender Day of Remembrance, where vigils will be held across the world to remember people who are transgender and who have lost their lives because of the prejudice and discrimination that is still around towards transgender people. So this is the spirit in which this event is taking place, and we very warmly welcome you to be with us this evening. I'd also like to warmly welcome our first panel member, that is Emily. Emily is a student on one of our MSc courses, but when she's not doing that, she is the Equality and Diversity Officer with the Student Union. And she is also our postgraduate officer. She's not afraid to use their voice in political environments to advocate for queer or trans rights. I'm told that they're always the best dressed in every meeting, and this is being epitomised for us tonight. And she is loving to critique capitalism through memes. It's all about the digital platforms and how we can overthrow capitalism for Emily. And Emily uses the pronouns she and they. Next up, I'd like to introduce Joe Clifford. Joe is now the author of over 90 over 100 professionally produced plays in every medium, and those plays have been seen all over the world. She performs her own work, and as well as that, she's a proud father and grandmother. What I found notable was that she gave the first public transgender reply from the Lassies in Glasgow in 2016. She also loves to run writers' workshops and has led them at the Traverse, the Festival Hub, in secondary schools in Valencia, in Singapore, in Mumbai. And as if that wasn't enough, she's designed and led master's courses in playwriting at Queen Margaret University, and she uses the pronouns she and they. Okay. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Elaine Gallagher. Elaine Gallagher is, by profession, an environmental manager, but also a writer of fiction, poetry and screenplays by vocation. And she is the writer of the film that we are about to watch. I also want to flag to you that her debut collection of poetry was published in October last year called Transient Light. And one of her poems, 239, is a particularly poignant look at Transgender Day of Remembrance. So we welcome Elaine Gallagher to be with us this evening.
Hi.
I have several more people to introduce to you. The next one is Rob Munro. Rob Munro joined Queen Margaret University as lecturer in digital media and communication in 2018, having completed his PhD in film studies that year. And he has also taught undergraduate film and media studies from 2015 to 2017. He has research interests around Scottish cinema, literary adaptation, film production, representation, and cultural policy. And he's also been working on a film and media project with education in Scotland, so looking at how we can bring film and media outside of formal education settings. So he's here with us tonight as well. And finally, my final panel member is Andrew Rook. Andrew Rook is one of the media production technicians at QMU, but he, beyond that, is an award-winning Canadian filmmaker who originates from Toronto. He completed his undergraduate film studies at Ryerson University before going on to achieve a master's degree in film directing from Edinburgh College of Art. And his work has also been screened in film festivals around the world. Okay, and he takes the pronouns he and him. I should also flag to you, for those who can't see, because we're in this online space, that I have another technician working behind the scenes. I have Callum Grant, who's done an absolutely fantastic job in setting all this up this evening. And I have David Stevenson, who is the Dean of the School of Assam, who is the one who's looking after the question and answer panel for us this evening. So there are lots of people who I need to thank for being here with us this evening and for making this event happen. So what is this event? What film are we going to watch? Well, the film that we're going to watch, that was written by Elaine Gallagher, stars Joe Clifford as the main protagonist. And this is a film called High Heels Aren't Compulsory that won the Best Scottish Short at SQUIF, the Scottish Queer International Film Festival, in 2015. It was also nominated for the Iris Prize, and it's been shown at multiple venues. It's been shown at the Fringe Queer Film and Arts Festival in London in 2015, at the Transgender Day of Remembrance in London again in 2015, and at the Whatever DIY Film Festival in London in 2015. But it had its premiere at Aberradox Film Festival in Edinburgh in 2015 and premiered at the Summer Hall Edinburgh as part of LGBT History Month 2015. So we're going to screen the film just now. I invite you to watch it back and watch it.
Ta-da!
Ta-da.
Oh, my feet are killing me. Feels like the first time.
Well, it is the first time.
Morning.
Carolyn.
Yes. Carolyn.
Helen.
Helen. Do you have a minute?
Oh, not even half a second.
No, I was talking to Caroline. Carolyn. How are you finding it? Your first day and so on?
Well, I've only just arrived, but good so far. Thank you, Jim. Little bit anxious, but I'll be fine.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that being the case, I have a favor to ask you. Assuming, of course, that you're up to it.
Okay, how can I help?
Well, Henry Wallace has taken ill again. And since you covered his first year anatomy class last year, would you be so good?
But the first class starts today.
Yes, sorry about the short notice and all that.
And this is a first year class. Oh, all my other classes know to expect me as, well, Carolyn now. As I told them last semester.
Yes, well, I'm sure they'll be fine. So, can I leave this with you?
Well, I suppose.
Excellent.
What the hell am I going to do?
Oh, I don't know. You could always teach the first year class.
Ah, bloody hell. Be a nightmare.
You weren't going to be lecturing in those, were you? Your feet hurt already and you've only just come in from the car. You're going to be standing for an hour at a stretch in front of a class. Do you have flats for in the lab?
Of course.
Wear them for lecturing too. Besides, you don't need them. You're tall enough already. And high heels aren't compulsory, you know. Like, don't worry. Nobody's going to be critiquing your shoes.
No. They'll be looking at everything else. To hell with it. They're going to have to deal with me sooner or later. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Mortimer, and I'm taking this class on from Professor Wallace. Now,
It's a lady boy.
this is the introductory anatomy class for biology and medical students. We'll be covering...
I saw them in Bangkok, lady boys. This is ridiculous. What's one of them doing lecturing us?
The materials we'll be covering will be familiar to you from your anatomy and physiology classes at school.
Bet you know all about anatomy.
Can I have quiet, please?
We pay good money to come here. I bet our parents would have something to say if they saw this thing teaching us.
Shut up, you ignorant piece of shit.
Last time, can I have quiet, please?
What was that?
If you don't stop disrupting this lecture, I'll...
Come on, speak up. We can't hear you.
Dr. Mortimer,
Sorry, can I help you?
you okay? Sorry, stupid question. They're shits, those medics. You left this behind.
Thank you.
Can we come in? Took us ages to find you. Like every toilet cubicle from the lecture hall to here.
I beg your pardon?
Toilets, where you go when you're upset. You got tissues, a cubicle door to close. There's usually one close by. You can hide quickly if you don't want anyone to see you. You can wash your face and fix your makeup whenever you're done crying.
I never thought of it.
Oh, something you never did before.
No, never.
Well, now you know.
Thank you. Was there anything I can do for you?
Well, laughing's a start.
Oh my God, what happened? You look like a badger's dribbled in your mascara. Who are you? What's going on?
I'm in Dr. Mortimer's anatomy class. She got heckled during the lecture. They were pretty horrible. I would have run.
Do you know who they were?
Callum Ferguson and that lot. Such dicks.
Wee shits. Right, I'm going to find them and string them up.
No, it's all right, Helen. I'm sorry, this isn't like me at all. I just made a complete fool of myself. I burst into tears and ran out.
Don't worry about making a fool of yourself. I'm sure it won't be the last time. You won't remember this. But I had this big presentation at a conference ages ago. It was funding bodies, the works, you know. Anyway, I'd gone to the toilet just before the presentation. And it wasn't till I turned to the blackboard that I realised my skirt was completely caught up in my tights.
So what did you do?
I turned to the audience and said, I do beg your pardon, fixed my skirt and went back to the blackboard. I mean, what else could I do? But I have never worn a skirt to work since. Oh, that's better. Come on, you've survived worse than this.
Yeah, you're right, I have. But I made such a fool of myself. Oh, I can't teach a class while I'm in this state.
I'm going to find Jim. We'll sort this out.
No, I'll deal with it myself. I'll just have to go right back in their next class and take care of them. It's been a while since I last performed a dissection, but I think I remember pretty well.
It's a lady boy. I saw them in Bangkok, lady boys. This is ridiculous. It's a lady boy. I saw them in Bangkok, lady boys. This is ridiculous. Lady boy. It's a lady boy. This is ridiculous. It's one of them doing lecturing us. We pay good money to come here. I bet our parents would have something to say if they saw that thing lecturing us.
You've survived worse than this.
Could I have some silence, please? Thank you. And welcome once again to the first year anatomy class. Ladies, gentlemen, and queers. And I say that because, statistically speaking, it is more than likely that I am not the only person in this room who does not conform to gender norms. It seems that some of us need a little refresher lesson in how to behave like human beings. Callum, Mark, and Rob, your behavior was unacceptable and will not be tolerated by the university. These are official warning letters from the department. One more disruption and you shall be suspended. Right then. We discovered last time the disruptive effect of hormones. The male hormone in particular. You'll go into developmental biology in later classes, but for now I thought I'd like to describe to you a little bit the effect of hormones on development during puberty. And specifically on the larynx and on the voice.
Good day, miss.
Very good day. Thanks, Harry. See you tomorrow.
I'm only cold and I'm only bitter 'cause you left me standing in the cold of the winter. And oh, like those leaves on those trees when it's bitter, falling away, take me away, I'm a sinner.
Okay, so that was High Heels Aren't Compulsory, written by Elaine Gallagher, produced by Lock Up Your Daughters and starring Joe Clifford. So I'm going to invite each of the panel members now to give a reflection on the film, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. And the first panel member who I'd like to invite to give a reflection is Elaine Gallagher. Elaine uses she, her pronouns.
Hi, thank you. So this is my first, or one of my first works. I write poetry, and as you very kindly said, I've got a book of poetry published now. But much of this really was coming about the time that I was transitioning 7 or 8 years ago. And yeah, I was just coming out. I was looking for a queer social life. I joined up Lock Up Your Daughters, who were a little bit old for, gay clubs or whatever. Social engagement. They made films and they got together for drinks, and it was a way to meet people like me who weren't part of my kind of straight social circle. So I had written this script while I was commuting to work because a pal had told me that the BBC were having a competition for trans-related comedy. In fact, this started out as a half-an-hour comedy screenplay for a pilot, which I wrote. I got told about this about 3 weeks in advance, and I wrote the 30-minute script in 3 weeks and 3 days. So I was 3 days too late for the competition. But I had it in hand when I met Lock Up Your Daughters, and Helen and the rest of them took a look at it and said, yeah, we'd make this. So we found funding from LGBT History Month. We actually produced it as a social event for the month, which is one of the reasons that we've got so many of the people as extras. We promoted it as an experience for LGBT people to become part of the activity. Pretty much everybody you see there is queer or queer adjacent. So this was a new experience for me. I'd done some filmmaking, but I'd never actually had anything that I had produced or produced. And Annabelle, who directed, she directed some radio. Evie, who's assistant director, had been involved in a couple of films. Really, in the production crew, the only person who actually knew what they were doing was Gary, who's a professional cinematographer that we'd hired in. One of the things that I was really keen to achieve from the funding was to be able to pay for things like that. We couldn't pay, obviously, equity rates, but everybody who performed and everybody who did work on the crew, they actually got something, which was which also meant that we were able to pay for things like the soundtrack and the sound quality, etc., and some extras like using a boom for cinematography. So, as I say, this was the first time, and this was my first or second screenplay, and Joe had at that time written maybe 80 screenplays, or had produced 80 scripts. So having somebody with such experience being able to have a look at it and give it a critique and notes was absolutely invaluable. Much of the ending came from Joe, the agency, the character taking agency and not having authorities step in and fix things for her came from Joe. And the collaboration of the experience was a brilliant experience. The nightmare scene came from Annabelle, and we had that set, the location to be able to shoot in, so we did it. And then we had massive arguments about where to put it in the film, so it was Yvette, the editor, who actually placed it in the right place. Being a poet and writing short stories, etc., is a very, very different experience. And it's a personal piece. Watching it again and seeing how much I actually had put of my fears still comes back to me. It's still not an easy piece for me to watch. I didn't realise until I was actually in counselling just how much of my fears that I'd put in, and a huge amount of my experiences as well. Pauline's story about her skirts came from a lecturer of mine originally who did this at, I think it was a United Nations presentation. The story about the toilets came to me from a pal who was telling me this is what girls do. You know, that Joe's character, Carolyn, I meant to be somebody who really doesn't know. This is her first experience. And what I was going to do was, in the original plan for the TV series, would be able to use this trans person who's coming to being female and the kind of female social issues later in life than not actually grown up with it. We'd be able to use this as a probe to look at sexism and violence and all those kinds of things with running jokes about, say, you know, what toilet are you going to use, which is a thing that people ask me all the time. And bullying, that was a thing that I recognised the character and wrote the character in from having been bullied in school. And I was given, we used this show as a presentation at work for, they were doing a diversity campaign. And the trainer came up to me afterwards to say that he recognised himself in that character. He was a smart-mouthed man, and he recognised the smart-mouthed little shit that he used to have been. And yeah, that kind of realisation, I'm really glad that people were able to kind of catch that from themselves, not just the supporting trans experience, but people actually seeing how much damage bullying can do and how much entitlement just lets you get away with not actually thinking about people. So I'm really glad it's out there. For Trans Awareness Week, the reason that I was writing this in the first place was, to get the screenplay made, but also that, you know, the letting people see what trans people's experiences are like. If we can get folk to identify with Joe's character, then maybe they'll think before they spout these kinds of criticisms, but, you know, comments, opinions, ideas. All of these things are things that I read in the papers or heard from people in the workplace before they ever knew that I was out. Fortunately, I've never actually come in, or I haven't very often come in for it after I transitioned. But all of this was stuff I was listening to before I came out. And maybe the happy ending will help other people as well. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you very much for that reflection. We're going to leave questions until the very end rather than take questions between the panel speakers. So do please hold on to your questions for the time being. Next, I'd like to invite Jo to give her reflection.
Thank you. I'm really glad I helped today with the script. That's nice to know. I mean, it's amazing to be here in QMU, to be watching this film here, because I used to be a professor of theatre here at QMU, and it was here, actually in this building, when it first opened, that I first presented myself as Jo. I started to live as a woman, and God, it was a wretched experience. It was awful. I was the first, and at that time the only trans person in the building. There'd been no preparation of any kind, no training. It was terrifying. And it's funny, just going to the loo before this started reminded me how frightening it was to go to the loo. In fact, I don't think I ever dared go to ladies when I was working here. I used to go to the disabled toilet. And so it was very wonderful to be asked to be in the film and to just use that experience in a way that, I don't know, hopefully, as Elaine says, hopefully helps the situation, that people can relate to Carolyn and relate to what she goes through. And it was very important that it had a happy ending, that she stood up for who she was, and I'm actually very proud of it. I'm very proud to watch it now, and it is amazing how you put a film like this out into the world and you've no idea where it's going to go. I was performing in Manchester, last year I suppose, in the Royal Exchange, and after I'd done my bit, somebody came up to me and said, "I've seen you before. You were in that film about high heels, weren't you?" And yes, I said, and they had watched the film that had been shown in their workplace, and it had really helped them and helped the situation they were in. And that's fantastic. I mean, I believe very strongly that art is a form of activism, and I think the Squee film is a really good example of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Next, I'd like to invite Emily Frood to give her reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say first, thank you, Elaine and Joe. I'm not to get to be a fangirl, but I am quite a big fan of a lot of your work, Eve, and your other work that I've seen at the Traverse is just incredible. So thank you. I definitely found this film, despite not having ever properly worked in the workplace, being a student, I still found so much of this film incredibly relatable. I had come out as trans just before starting uni, so I kind of went through a lot of those anxieties and fears just before I'd started. I was in my last year of high school, and there's all those things about like how people react, and you think so much about like what other people are doing that I think a lot of the time we forget what we're going to be doing. And I think that it's the kind of like you were saying as well, Elaine, there's such a steep learning curve when you come out as trans, because there's so much that you either didn't experience or don't experience now that you have to get used to, and whether that's in terms of your expression or in terms of, bathrooms or like the kind of gendered protocol within social interactions that I think is for a lot of people subconscious, but that I think the minute you come out as trans, it becomes very conscious and you have to think about it quite a lot. That I really appreciated the kind of empowerment of the film, and I've definitely gotten to a point where I am a kind of take no shit person. Because I think you have to be, and the fact that we still have conversations, or that I think that we're starting to have more conversations about trans rights, that we have to be for ourselves, the take no shit people. But yeah, I think I also really appreciated Helen's character, and I think the importance of at least just one person and the impact that kind of support can have on you as an individual. I had that in high school where there was one teacher I knew. It turns out he'd had a trans daughter. So we started talking about it, and I was like, oh my God, like I'm trans as well. Like, what can I do for like help and support at school and whatever? And like the importance of that is integral, and for I think a lot of people life-saving. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Emily. Next, I'd like to invite Robert Monroe to give his reflection, and Robert uses he, him pronouns.
Hi everyone. Thanks to Shan for organising the event and inviting me along. It's really fantastic to see events like this happening at Queen Margaret, and as you mentioned, that the pandemic hasn't put a halt to them. It's really great to have this on this week. Thanks to Joe and Elaine, obviously, for making the film and getting out there in the world, which we all know is not an easy thing to do and takes a lot of hard work and perseverance. As well as discussing the themes of the film, as kind of Elaine mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of practical aspects of the filmmaking process that our students would benefit from discussing too. As for the film itself, I really enjoyed it. I think it does a really good job of putting us in her shoes, if that's not too laborious a pun to use at this point. I really like the way it begins. There's no explanation needed for Carolyn's journey, no kind of overly sentimental sort of backstory. It comes up later on when her colleague Helen says, "You survived worse than this." We know there must be so many things that she's gone through to get to this point, and it does it really subtly. I think it does what all good films do, especially short films, puts us into the narrative in the present tense in a really critical moment in a character's life. Especially in a short film where you've got to get people's attention quickly. And again, those opening shots, we feel her anxiety before we know what situation she's going into. And that's something that both Elaine and Joe mentioned. I think, again, like all good films, it offers both like the specificity of Carolyn's experience, but also the universality that anybody can empathise with her experience in that moment very, very easily. So obviously the nature of the harassment of Carolyn is transphobic and unique to trans people. But in using that kind of public lecture and the fear of public speaking and public humiliation that we all feel, and certainly as a lecturer, I feel pure terror about whenever I step into a room. It really, cuts across identities and makes it very universal. As Elaine and Joe mentioned, has that really powerful classic narrative structure of the protagonist encountering obstacles and overcoming them through her own agency and determination. That voicelessness, she's forced into this situation of voicelessness in the lecture, and I just thought it was a really nice piece of writing, and that's how she overcomes that as well through her use of the voice. As Emily and Elaine mentioned, I think having the allies there, the two students, and Helen, the colleague, again, and highlighting the moment of the toilet, as Elaine mentioned, again, was a really nice piece of writing. And again, thinking about Transgender Awareness Week, as Shan introduced it earlier on, I think the film is very successful in raising awareness of that kind of everyday harassment and prejudices suffered by trans people, which perhaps are not as widely seen and reported as they might be. Shan at the beginning mentioned sort of my interest in education and film and education, and it seems to me that this film is absolutely relevant to be used in other educational contexts. Obviously, we're screening it here as part of Queen Margaret, but the secondary schools, for example, thinking about Emily's journey that she mentioned there, being able to raise awareness through cinema, I think, is a very important thing. And I know that Squift do some outreach work, the Scottish Queer International Film Festival. So yeah, well done to Joe and Elaine and everyone else involved in making the film. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to following the discussion that follows.
Rob. And last but by no means least, I'd like to invite Andrew Rook to give his reflection, and Andrew uses he, him pronouns too.
Andrew, you're muted.
The one thing I was told not to do is mute myself. Thanks very much. When I first saw this film some time ago, I had instantly thought that it would have been of great benefit of me to have saw this a long time before then, as my master's film dealt with a trans male lead, essentially going through a struggle to come out to his family and be accepted by them. And coming from a sort of cis-normative straight background, I had to do a lot of research and reach out to focus groups in order to make sure that the content being presented was authentic, never mind interesting. So seeing something like this, which just screams, as Robert said, a very specific but broadly relatable and empathetic experience, was extremely fulfilling for me to see. That said, during my PhD studies, I'm looking at a lot of gender theory, and I find a lot of the different parts of this film apply to a sort of broader gender theory aspect. And of course, I'm very benefited to have the writer to comment on this as well. But I find that there's a thread of feminine allyship or sisterhood that is present throughout the entire film. Carolyn's return to work is immediately made less anxious, as Robert said, by the warm welcome of her coworker Helen. But conversely, there's male antagonism that faces Carolyn throughout her workday, from her coworker Jim's milquetoast support of her return, getting her name wrong even after being explicitly told that it's Carolyn, not Caroline, and the lack of consideration in assigning her a last-minute lecture. This, of course, further highlighted by the horrendous and hurtful comments made by Callum and his friends. The support offered to Carolyn by Helen and Josie are indicative of an acceptance offered without conditions or selfishness, and make a clear statement that any idea of otherness in society is one that is often reinforced by patriarchal expectations of gender norms. The verbal attacks made by Callum and his mates to Carolyn make them a victim of something motivated by a sort of tribal or hegemonic masculinity that lashes out at anyone in society that doesn't adhere to cis-normative standards in order to reinforce the power structures that allow such attacks to take place in the first place. The male servitor who greets Carolyn as she enters and leaves the building serves as a fitting bookmark to the film. Shortly after the film's introduction, his cold and uncertain use of female pronouns is contrasted by his kinder and more certain demeanor as the film ends, showing that he has undergone a personal change in perspective, and that it is possible for men in the world of the film as well as in real life to be allies instead of antagonists in situations like this. And perhaps an important takeaway from this ending is that all of society, regardless of belief systems or personal upbringing, can take steps towards changing their attitudes and being more inclusive, or as the film puts it, behaving like a human being.
Right, thank you, Andrew. Okay, I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I'm going to invite David to read those questions to the panel members. Right. Do we have any questions yet, or are we waiting for them to come in? Okay. Just take a few minutes just to wait for questions to come in through the panel.
Oh, well, can I just say how amazed, how wonderful it is to meet you and to discover that you were able to come out at school. I think that is incredible.
Yeah, it was a surreal experience, I won't lie. I'm trying to think, it is now 5 years ago. It'll be 5 years in December since I came out, and it feels like a lifetime ago. It was only 5 years, but it feels like it's maybe a bit too poetic, but it feels like I've lived, more of a life in that 5 years than I did in the past, 17. But yeah, I definitely feel incredibly lucky, both to have come out in high school and to have experienced very little, comparatively to a lot of people I know, the kind of discrimination and hate that so many people get. Obviously Friday's T-door, and I was, because I'm a little bit sadistic, I naturally had been looking at the figures and everything, and this year the TGEU had stated that the number of trans people recorded murdered was 350 this year, which is an increase on the past couple of years, and it's just really terrible that kind of still happens in such a direct way. And I think it only gets, or it does get better, but it has gotten progressively worse in the past couple of years, particularly online, through online journalism and print media and Twitter. God forbid I live on Twitter, but I still read so much of the garbage that people talk about, whether it's high profile, particularly, unfortunately, high profile women, or whether it's journalists in, tabloid newspapers or The Guardian or whatever. But it's such a toxic environment, and it's so difficult to push past and to ignore. But I think, yeah,
it's two things at once. I mean, my grandson, who's in primary school, there is a girl in his class who, until quite recently, was a boy.
Primary school.
In primary school in the Black Isle, north of Inverness. I mean, and you just think, my God, things are changing so fast. And I think that goes hand in hand with the toxicity and hostility that you're talking about. I mean, so two sides of the same coin. Yeah.
Right, I have some questions. Just before I go into them, we have a key theme which we may need to deal with separately, which Joe is your necklace. Just because the public demand it, and I'm dealing with quite a lot of traffic around about the necklace. Wow. There is significant compliments, and people would just like to know if it has any particular significance or if it's just a beautiful thing.
Just a very beautiful thing. I might have got it for an opening. I mean,
that's gorgeous.
I once I had a play open in the West End, and I might have got it for that opening.
Well, there's a number of people who are very complimentary about it. So,
thank you, everybody.
So moving on, we've got a question, and Joe, this one specifically to you. which is just thinking around about how your feelings about working in, or I guess interacting with, large institutions have evolved or changed since the difficult experiences you talked about when you were working at QMU. Have they altered or adapted?
I suppose, when I was at school, coming out was absolutely impossible. Because I was born in the 50s, I'm 70, I'm very old, and there is a massive, massive change that has happened in my lifetime. But certainly in the 60s, when I was at secondary school, I knew that if I came out, I'd have been hounded to death, literally. And it was a very, very painful experience for me, because I loved acting at school. I loved playing female parts. And I thought, if people get to know how much I enjoy this, my life isn't going to be worth living. It's a boys' boarding school in Bristol. And what the result of that was that, although in a way I discovered my vocation as an actor and a performer when I was at school, it was completely blocked. So I was blocked. I couldn't perform for about 40 years. It wasn't until I started to come out around about 2000 that I started to be able to perform again. So yes, horrific experiences. And again, I think I came to QM, I don't know, 1995 or something like that. Soon after I came, I stopped wearing male clothes, actually. I started to wear women's clothes, women's, I don't know what you might call gender neutral clothes, but they were women's, and that helped me. I remember I got my ears pierced, it was terrifying. And so the whole process of transitioning and coming out took a long time for me, and it was interrupted by all sorts of things, by my late wife dying of a brain tumour, and then soon after that I had to go into hospital to have open heart surgery. So it was a long process. And I guess, yeah, I mean, it's very scary. Very scary. I kind of feel all right in this building now, more or less. But I mean, coming out as a performer, my play, Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Heaven, when that opened in 2009, that was one of the very first shows I wrote and performed in. At the Tron, there were hundreds of demonstrators in the street outside the theatre for the first night and all through the run. And there were hundreds and thousands of people online, furious with me, telling me what shit I was, how rubbish it was. So it's been a hard it's been a hard process. And I think one of the things about being in the public eye from the very beginning is that it's made me very tough, I guess, or I'd have gone under, actually, to be honest. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it does, very honestly and openly. So this next one is more, I guess, to everybody on the panel. So feel free to chip in. A question here around about, what do you think next steps are regarding positive trans representation on screen? So what's next?
Would anybody like to answer that first? Elaine. Okay.
Well, one of the things that we need to be doing is having trans people not having specifically trans stories. So what we've got previously, let's say, it was unheard of for a black man to play the president, and then things became better until Morgan Freeman played the president in a movie before there was actually a black man in the White House. What we need to be doing is having trans people be able to just be trans, but not doing things that are trans related. So we have actually, it was Supergirl had a trans superheroine, and most of the time, yeah, she is just playing a kind of newbie hero, and there's background issues and all of the other things that are part of her life that, yes, she's trans and other things happen, but most of the stories are just about her helping Supergirl. And in Star Trek, the new Discovery, they have a non-binary and a trans actor playing a couple in the new series. I don't know whether or not it's actually going to come out that the characters themselves are trans in some way, but so far they haven't actually made any issue of it. So these kinds of things, just actually having trans people be accepted as a functioning member of society and not be the dancing bear that is, look at that trans person doing that thing.
Fabulous. Thank you, Elaine. Would anybody else like to respond to that question?
I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Especially if you're old like myself. So the only parts that I can get in plays are ones I write myself. At the moment, I'm involved in a version of the Ugly Duckling called The Not So Ugly Duckling, in which I'm not a trans character. I'm just one of two women telling each other's story. And you're right, Elaine. That is the way forward. And let's hope all of these things happen.
Yes, to be incidentally trans would be a
great thing.
Would be a wonderful thing indeed. Anybody else have any reflections on that? Andrew.
I think there's obviously something to be said that representation is a form of both education and activism and a key element. But I think there's also an obligation for filmmakers who are outside of certain spheres or circles that they're trying to represent to do the research themselves as well. I recall in an interview for the 2013 film Dallas Buyers Club, the director Jean-Marc Vallée defended casting Jared Leto in a trans role by saying that he was not aware that there was such a thing as trans actors, which of course sounds ridiculous, as ridiculous now as it probably did in 2013, I hope. But it also shows just how damaging a well-meaning director can be if the research is not being done.
Thank you, absolutely.
So the next question, and following on from a comment that Andrew had made there, that in the film, the women that you see are represented, framed as more clearly accepting and helpful and an ally. But the question here is, do the panel think that that is generally the case, or is it framing in a particular way?
That's a very difficult question, because you think about the way in which the discussions about trans rights, particularly currently it's the Gender Recognition Act and legislation, but you think about the discussions around trans rights and online, the conversations are predominantly dominated by so-called women's advocacy or women's rights groups or organizations, and they dominate a kind of transphobic viewpoint of the debate, which is another stupid word for it. But so there's a fear, and I definitely have it too, and I've talked about it in private conversations with other people, is that I definitely do have not a fear of other women, but I definitely feel this apprehension about talking to women, particularly about trans rights. And I think, or about me being trans, I was just going to the bathroom before and had to go around the corner, and there's quite a large group of, just female students, but there's a fear about being, challenged or targeted, or just thinking that they're gonna be afraid of you, or that they're gonna react in some horrendous way. So I think there's definitely a balance to both the support that I think is absolutely there in sisterhood and allyship between both cis women and trans people, but also the conversations about the fear and the vitriol that is talked about.
I don't think these transphobic women that come online are in any way representative.
No, absolutely not. No.
I mean, I'm trying to think. Have I met one?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
I don't think I have. I really don't think I have. I mean, I do know one, but we haven't seen each other for ages. But no, it's very, very sad that these people who have really nothing better to do with their lives.
That's the thing.
How sad is that than be hateful? How terrible. Poor loves.
Elaine?
A lot of the things that I wrote in there were from friends. My general experience has been that I came out to pals and they said, right, we're going shopping. That was the first thing that they said. And the sort of female togetherness, the sisterhood is a very welcoming one when they just accept you. It's the ones who are trying to, I think, make an identity out of it and are mistaking trans people for not real women, and trans men for not real men, trans women for not real women, I say. The thing about earlier experiences that you hear from a lot of feminists, including one previously good friend, that's really enough, but I don't think it actually stops a trans woman from being harassed and abused by the patriarchy. I didn't experience sexual harassment or assault until after I'd come out. All of the things that women take for granted, I've experienced not as often as cis women have actually grown up with, because I didn't grow up knowing about them. But hell, it came as a shock as soon as I hit it. Something that a pal quoted to me, a trans woman came out and she, I quote, parachuted onto the glass ceiling, unquote. Yeah, that happened to me. I quit my job as an environmental manager and I write for a living now because I can't actually get a job anywhere else. And yeah, all of these things kind of add up. So to me, I think that the political opinion, and I've met them too because I'm doing politics, I'm standing as a councillor for the Greens. They're a very, very small minority. I've met one or two in the Westminster campaign out of hundreds of people. They're there and they're loud, but they're very, very much in the minority.
Thank you.
And I guess just following on from that question, there is a specific question for you around about how do you feel that attitudes that you encounter in society more broadly towards transgender people have changed in the last few years?
Yep.
They've changed a lot. I was devastated pretty much as I was coming out by the death of Lucy Meadows, who was hounded into suicide by the newspapers, so much so that the coroner at the inquest actually blamed the journalists. That kind of thing is what I would have expected 20, 30 years ago, because I grew up in the 80s. And yeah, there was no way that I would have come out then. And at the time, people were still trying to hound lesbians into being straight. So, time goes on and people's attitudes change. And I think one of the reasons that people are politically against trans people are so strident is because they're the end of the minority and they can see their opinions crumbling and the support for the opinions crumbling. At the first trans pride you could actually see a generation gap between the people older and younger than about 30. And the folk who were older than 30 looked like myself. You could see that at some point in their lives, and possibly still, they were running scared. And the folk younger than 30 were out and proud and confident and knew that they had a place to be able to be flamboyant as well as not actually have to hide in the woodwork.
Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, specific question just around about how widely the film has been distributed. So we've got a comment here that just says that they think that it would be particularly useful or equally useful for equal opportunities training in the NHS. And is it widely available for this purpose? Can it be used in that way?
Annabelle, the director, is the one who actually sent all the sort of petitions so we'd have to actually add. I don't know what the legalities of it are now, but I'm pretty sure that if you got in touch with Joe's production company, Annabelle Cooper, who directed, she's the one who's been managing that.
So you have to Google Queen Jesus Productions. That's the way to get hold of Annabelle.
Next question there is around about this being a really good way to open up conversations about diversity and inclusion and to think about how we value persons for who they are. So what more do the panel think we can do to include persons as persons, irrespective of how we or they identify?
I'm going to run the risk of delving into an anti-capitalist rant in a second, but I think it becomes we should probably have a conversation about how we think about work and how we value people within the workplace as people before profit, because I think that's probably where it stems from partially. But I agree that this film is incredibly important for starting that kind of conversation as thinking about how we value people. But yeah, I think fundamentally it comes from a change in the way we think about employment. But I'm going to cut it off there before I get proper socialist.
Rob, you've talked about using the film in educational settings. I wonder if you see uses for this in that way in response to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as Emily mentioned there, and as the question alludes to, it prompts fantastic conversations about diversity and the different experiences that people have, based on their gender identity. I actually wrote something down that Emily said because it had never occurred to me as Andrew, a kind of cis-normative man. Emily said one of the things after transitioning was always thinking about gender protocols and social interactions. And again, it would, as you said, it would be unconscious for many people, and it's something that I would never really have to think about. So obviously that comes out of the discussion afterwards from the film, but you could absolutely see part of it might come through teacher training as well, but teachers being able to facilitate conversations with young people about the different types of experiences that different groups of people have within society that many of us are ignorant of, quite frankly.
Thank you, Rob. Any other reflections on opening conversations around diversity and inclusion from the panel?
I will just add a personal story as well. It was what must have been my 5th or so week at uni, and I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, having just come out. I thought, I'm not going to take any of it. I had a lecture, it was funnily enough about representation, and we talked about trans and intersex people, and the language that this lecturer had used was quite, I guess, outdated and somewhat insensitive. And I'd gone through this lecture thinking about it a lot, and I was thinking, do I go up to him at the end? I'm a tiny first-year uni student who knows ultimately nothing about the rest of what is being talked about. But I thought, sod it, I'll do it. And I'd had a conversation with them about it, and it was actually a really good point of learning. I think for both of us, and me and getting my confidence, but also for him as a lecturer, and thinking about inclusive language in teaching. Yeah, I think it's really important.
That is really important, isn't it? It's about actually being yourself in every situation and not hiding. And it's all the work I do, well, events like this, but also in creating art and being out there. I think we all have an effect on the world that we know nothing about, and it's probably much greater than we imagine. The world is changing. What does Queen Jesus say? Talking about people full of hatred, it's no matter what they say or what they do, they cannot stop the change that is coming, and one day we will all be free.
Powerful, thank you.
So question picking up or relating to that. So the panel have thoughts about the importance of seeing positive representations of trans people in all forms of media at a time when trans people's lives and trans people's bodies are being debated within a media sphere. So what part does it play around about seeing the types of representation that we've seen in the film?
I think it's incredibly important. My dear sister Renata Carvalho, who plays the part of Queen Jesus in Brazil, she says it's revolutionary that to be in a room with an openly proud trans person is unbelievably important, because once you've had that experience, you cannot think of a trans person as a thing. And I can remember when I first came out how often people would refer to me in the street as it. Well, once you've encountered somebody, once you and your lecturer have had that encounter, then that doesn't happen anymore. And yes, representation is so important. It's unbelievably important. It's probably the most, as an artist, I think it's the most important thing that, most important weapon, the most important tool that I have. And when I was young and there was no representation of trans people at all, zero, zilch, nothing, I remember being so lost and so confused because I had no means of understanding who I was. And it is, for me, it's a great privilege, it's a great honor to be able to be the kind of person for young people that I needed to be when I was young, if that makes sense. That makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well,
I think that you've been that kind of person for so many people. I know that when, as another feather in my cap, I was at the time just a member of the LGBT society here at uni, but we'd gone along to see Jesus, Queen of Heaven at the Traverse, and I remember the way that I had personally reacted to it in such a, dare I say, life-changing way. But the way I'd seen other people find it so important to them, whether it's in a personal relationship to faith or just seeing a trans person on a stage like that, and seeing the experiences that you've talked about in other instances, and knowing that you kind of get through them eventually. It's a hard slog, but we all push through it. And I think the trans stories are so integral to the survival of trans people, but also as a kind of intergenerational teaching, I think. Passing down that knowledge of experience to younger trans people or older trans people, newer trans people, I guess, depending on whatever age you come out, so that we have all these experiences and solidarity that can help us become stronger people to kind of go through society.
Any thoughts on positive representation from any of the online panelists? Rob?
Yeah, just kind of following on from what was said there, I think we think about the power of representation quite often in two ways. Firstly, to give validity to life experiences, for as you said, kind of young trans people, being able to see trans people on the stage or on screen, validates your unique, experience in a way that is very powerful. But secondly, and it's a bit of a cliche when you think about film as a window to the world, as a window into other lives and experiences, that you would maybe not come across in your everyday kind of existence. So I think there's that kind of dual thing for people having their own experience validated, and then for others to have that different viewpoint, a widening of their own perspective.
Thank you. Elaine?
There's the negative perception as well. I mean, when I was growing up, and Joe tells these stories as well, the films that we saw treated trans people as horrors. You got Silence of the Lambs, for example, but you've also got Jim Carrey at, what was it, Ace Ventura, and it turns out that the villain's a trans person, and everybody turns around when she's exposed and throws up. And having these kinds of things be phased out so that you get sympathetic portrayals of trans people in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and you got Jared Leto playing the person in Dallas Buyers Club, but at the same time it was actually a thing where this was a drama about a trans person, not a mockery of them. And that kind of changing so that people growing up don't internalize the idea that they're freaks and perverts, which is a really, really difficult label to get rid of from your soul once you've actually internalized it. I'm really glad that generationally younger trans people aren't being bombarded with this as being the only representation that they actually have of themselves.
Thanks.
Next question is for Emily, Joe and Elaine. And are there any questions or assumptions that you are just tired with dealing with now?
Where to start? I guess we can talk about the film, just to bring it back a little, is that I think, not that I've really had it personally, but the expectation about gender conformity and the expectation to behave and express your gender in a way that adheres to a very specific example of I guess a one of two cisgender identities. So I think, I'm kind of tired of the expectations. I always hate the I guess the entitlement that a lot of people have about the minute you disclose your trans identity to someone, people think it's fair game, open season to start talking about very intimate and personal things about your identity and your body that you would never talk about with other people. So I think it's probably those two things, is the very intimate and the expectations.
Next question is just thinking around about the workplace that was shown, and obviously we've spoken about that earlier, but Do the panel have thoughts around about how workplaces can be made easier for trans people working and being in them, and potentially in particular for people who are engaged in teaching?
I mean, I guess films like this being shown widely will help. I think the presence of people like yourself on this campus, that helps enormously. The fact that we have, allies on campus. That's all these things are really important. They really matter. Luckily, I don't go into workplaces anymore, so I really shouldn't be talking about it because I don't know what I'm talking about. But I remain such an optimist because things are changing so much. Even coming here on a taxi. I never have any problem about disclosing who I am or coming out to taxi drivers. They're always lovely. Always lovely. Had such a nice time in the hairdressers before coming here. I mean, the things are, when I remember how frightened I was and how hostile the world seemed when I was, 20 years ago or something, when I was just trying to find a way forward to come out. I think it's miraculous. Astonishing. So I remain optimistic, fiercely optimistic. And of course my leaf that I wear around my neck day and night protects me and keeps me safe.
Thank you, Joe. Anyone else who is in the workplace? Emily, it's effectively you're in the workplace, and Elaine, you've just left. You had to leave the workplace. I wonder if you have any thoughts to offer on how we can make workplaces a more welcoming and friendly place to be.
I left the place because I absolutely hated where I was working. Not because it was particularly hostile to trans people. I was working for the MOD at Faslane, and that turns out to be a really, really safe place to have transitioned. It was very bureaucratic, and I had to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. But the military do these orders, and as soon as any of the senior staff heard that this was happening, they just gave orders saying that if I got any trouble, then they would kick absolute arse.
Brilliant.
Yeah. The reason it was because I didn't be involved in nuclear weapons. And then what I've found out is that to actually get back into civilian work as someone with an experience of over 10 years of being an environmentalist, as soon as you disclose you're trans, then agents don't call you back. And I think it's the unconscious bias, not necessarily that the agents are hostile, but they think that the clients might be. And, how am I going to put this person into working as a consultant in, for example, a bank? What will they say? Will we lose jobs and never actually get work coming back to us? So that unconscious bias, I think, is a thing that we need to work on, that it's actually all right for trans people to be in the workplace. One of the first things that I did before I came out was I worked very hard at being recognised as competent in my job. And then when I transitioned, the fact that everybody knew that I could do my job meant that, well, okay, there's this personal quirk that Elaine has, but you can still ask her what the environmental issues are and you'll get the same answer.
Thank you, Elaine.
Really interesting point, because I think a lot of employees, and I had it in when I come out in high school, my principal, they seem to be fighting fires that don't exist. and they think that the world is going to crumble, or the workplace or the school that you're in is going to crumble because a trans person decides to come out and exist, because they think it's going to be 24/7 phone calls or angry letters or strongly worded emails that are never going to come, because people usually can't be bothered having that much of an opinion unless you're really hateful. But yeah, they seem to get up in a panic for no reason. And I think that's part of the conversation that needs to be had, is people need to calm down and just, like, you're dealing with a human being. They work, they have interests and favorite colors and, you know, sports teams and whatnot. And I think it's, yeah, we just need to chill for a minute, you know?
Thanks.
I was noting the fact that our solution to workplace is both simultaneously to chill and kick arse. So some combination of the two, and we'll be sorted. Just a couple of comments, people thanking everyone that was involved in the film, and just a comment here saying, you know, there are so few films that have trans people playing trans roles, let alone where the script has also been written by a trans person. And also just talking about the importance of representation and presence, that they think your film makes your character impossible to resist, even for those who resist the idea of trans people. So thank you very much for the experience of both watching and viewing it. Elaine, particularly for you, there was a question just around about your experience of writing it, and you touched on that previously, but there was just, if you could tell us any more about what that felt like to write it, and so just expanding, I think, on what you were talking about earlier.
I'd been writing for a while, but never actually publishing things, and it was good to actually have this goal. I had a deadline of 3 weeks, which, as I say, I missed, but yeah, 30-minute script in 3 weeks and 3 days, I think, is still pretty good. When I came up with the solution to, like, the ending, and worked kind of back from there about the voice, etc., that all kind of, I hung it on a film script structure of effectively 3 acts divided into 5 sections, and, you know, by this many pages is this many minutes, by that time I need to have done this. That kind of, like, structural work meant that I could move the actual beats in the right place, and the character voice and the dialogue, etc., kind of came from the people around me. I have very, very funny friends, and I pay attention to stories that they tell, and I really do like kind of sardonic humor. I grew up watching MASH. I absolutely love that show, and that's basically the foundation of my sense of humor. And since I was doing it for a BBC sitcom, effectively I wanted to do MASH, but involving a trans person as being the kind of straight person everybody is kind of weird around. And then after that, there was the collaborative effort. And getting notes back from Joe and notes back from Annabelle, and all of us working together to write the thing and direct and produce it, was a huge amount of fun. The fact that we had that really weird looking space in the summer hall, that used to be a veterinary hospital, and we had that lovely amphitheatre, the teaching room that we filmed most of it there, but the large animal class, that kind of hospital-like looking place, was disused and around the corner and free for us to film in. And Annabelle was like, yeah, let's do that, figure out what we can do with it afterwards. So once that was all kind of done, having Yvette do the editing meant that she was the person who put the story together, because Annabelle's idea was that we should put the nightmare at the very beginning. And the fact is that the way that I saw it was that the kind of future forward-looking, Carolyn, the character, hasn't met this person. If you do this, then she looks kind of like she looks much more anxious than I wanted her to be. So what we've got is just ordinary apprehension rather than future terrors come in. And then when you have the nightmare in the place where Yvette actually puts it, then the fear is justified. And you have somebody reacting to actual trauma, going through the trauma and going back into the fray to actually take the back control. And again, this didn't come from me or from Annabelle or from the argument. It came from Yvette, the editor, and I reckon the editors have to be just as much storytellers as the writers do.
It is a very powerful way to end that film on Carolyn coming into her own. I really like the way that was ended. It was a very good editorial choice that was made there.
And just a question then around about the title, High Heels Aren't Compulsory, and the assumption is that it's been obviously chosen intentionally, and is this commenting on an expectation that exists for trans women to perform femininity in some way?
Very much. I was coming out to friends long before I ever actually transitioned. This is about 20 years ago. One of my first friends over the internet, we were discussing things like the expectations of shoes. And she had an injured ankle that she had been wearing like 2-inch heels, and I got it caught in the gutter. And I said something like, people would expect me to be wearing heels. And she actually said, high heels aren't compulsory. And the idea that this is what you have to be wearing is effectively false. It's not feminist for a start, which you have the political actors all saying, well, trans people don't look like this, or they don't look like women. And then you have the trans people trying to look like women, and they say, well, you're not trying hard enough. That's not actually feminist at all. Objectifying any person about, by what they wear. But also, a social worker I knew told me a story about a person that she had gone to see. The police had arrested them because they were out wearing the 3. And on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock, they'd been out in Kelvin Bridge wearing high heels and a party dress. Now, this was somebody going to the gender clinic and hadn't actually had friends to be able to tell them what a woman in Glasgow wears at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. They didn't have the experience to know. They didn't have anybody actually telling them, well, look, here's how you look, how you dress to fit in. All they could do was just, okay, women wear dresses. And the thing was that the reason that they were wearing a dress was because the doctor at the gender clinic insisted that they wear a dress, otherwise they wouldn't get seen. So you have the medical establishment's expectations as well. So, the gendered expectations are a really, really strong thing. And to be able to fight against them and to be able to undermine them is not just a help for trans people, it's a help for every person. It's a feminist act as much as it is a trans rights act.
Yeah, absolutely. Who needs high heels? Who needs high heels?
When I did my reply of the lasses in the Burn Supper, it was in front of Nicola Sturgeon.
Mm-hmm.
And she always wears these killer heels, and she said, yes, they are compulsory. It was a joke. She was joking. I don't think she was being very serious. But,
Gosh.
so it's funny. It's funny that she does. It amazes me. And when I'm in awe at how well she manages them. I actually didn't have a pair when it came to making this particular film, and I think Elaine lent me a pair of hers that were horribly uncomfortable for me. There's one bit where I was not acting. I couldn't walk in the bloody things.
And we've got a question relating to earlier on we were talking about it becoming incidental, that someone was trans. And so there's a question there around about is the aim or is the intent that we reach the point whereby trans refers to a period of transition and is not around about a kind of identity that someone then continues to carry forth with them.
It's a really interesting point. I think I would never, as much as I want trans identities to be incidental, I think at the same time I find a lot of comfort and empowerment in having a trans identity. So I wouldn't ever, even if that kind of comfortability became available in my lifetime, I think I would still find the language of saying that I am trans and that I am non-binary very integral to who I am as a person. But I totally understand where that comes from. Being just yourself and not having additional labels for whatever attribute of your life it pertains to. But I think, for a lot of people, myself included, I find it very important and integral as opposed to incidental, which is, I guess, almost a counterpoint to what we were saying about it being incidental. So it's a weird balance to strike, I think. I guess it's more just letting people do whatever they want and using the language that they want to use, I think, is probably the baseline.
When I was young, when I was 18, I fell in love with a man and he fell in love with me. And I remember the agony we went through because our relationship was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't, it was against the law for us to love each other. And the total agony of that. And then I can remember when gay men first started to turn up as characters in films, what a huge deal it was. And it isn't anymore. And I don't, the fact that I'm trans doesn't, it is both a very, very important part of who I am, but at the same time, well, so what? Here I am.
Yeah.
Here I am. Life is good. Aren't I lucky? Aren't I lucky that I don't live in Russia, for instance, or in the Middle East, where I'd be dead by now? And aren't I lucky I don't live in Brazil? I spend a lot of time in Brazil where I can, and it's dangerous, very dangerous to be us there. But thank goodness I live in Scotland by some miracle, and I'm alive, and at least for now, I am safe and happy and proud in who I am. End of story.
And sorry, just to hear from Elaine as well on that point. I think that's really important to hear from each of you.
I think that it's important that people don't make a massive fuss about trans people being trans, and especially that there's no bigotry or discrimination about them. But at the same time, I think being trans is a fundamental part of every trans person. The thing is that each person, however they express it, whether they're non-binary or femme or butch or whatever, they look at the way that they've been assigned gender and that they've performed it up until then and said, no, that's not me. And then gone through if society becomes really accepting, then it becomes easy to do, and everybody says, yeah, okay, on yourself, then that would be lovely. But at the moment, everybody has to take that decision, look at the difficulties, and then say, I am going to do it anyway, because this is how I'm more true to myself. So I think that, just like the president being black shouldn't be a thing, and yet it is, a trans person being trans and yet going on to be, I'm standing for council, so being a politician shouldn't be a thing, and yet it is. It's a fundamental part of their perspective, and they bring a perspective to the way that they do things, so their understanding of how people approach difficult decisions, say, or take control of the life for themselves.
Yeah. Okay, so integral to identities.
There are a number of comments, just thanking the panel for their answers and their discussions. Indeed, there's a question asking as to whether the panel has any plans for future social events. So I'm clearly taking bookings for you now. I'll pass them on. But we've got a question here from someone in Canada who says hello as well, as a fellow Torontonian there to Andrew. And specifically, it's looking for the behind-the-scenes gossip. So, cutting to the chase, were there any blooper moments in making the film that you can recall?
You were talking about the car.
Yeah, so you were talking about driving.
Yes, how terrified I was in the car, and could only. I think I managed to let the brake off and pretend that's how I got there. Blooper moments. I don't remember any. All I remember is how lovely it was to have this wonderful makeup lady hovering around with all these brushes in her case, like a plumber, sorting me out at moments of crisis. It must have fallen over. I probably forgot my lines a lot. I'm sure I forgot my lines a lot. It was a very, very happy few days. That's what I remember. I remember enjoying it a lot. It's funny, when I was young, I hated cameras. I hated being photographed, because it was like the experience of looking in the mirror. When I looked in the mirror when I was young, I didn't recognize myself. Mm-hmm. I saw a boy and I thought, I don't know who this boy is. And whenever somebody took a photograph of me, it was as if that captured that moment in a way that was really, really hurtful. So it never crossed my mind that I would ever enjoy being in a film, but actually I love being on the stage, and I love being in front of a film camera. And so my abiding memory of that whole shoot was just what a joy it was to do.
Elaine, do you want to jog Joe's memory?
I think there were in particular bloopers. I do remember that what we should have done, because Joe especially worked like a Trojan. She's in most of the scenes, if not all of them, and what we should have done was schedule most of Joe's work first, especially in that big crowd scene. And yeah, we had the extras all kind of trooping in first thing in the morning and then got rid of them by noon, and I'd done all of those shots. But by the end of it, the interaction between Joe and Callum, everybody was exhausted, and we had an awful lot more retakes because, yeah, we were just so tired. So what we should have done was recognise that Joe had been working so hard and that the extras really weren't working so hard, and the sort of fatigue of the main players. And yeah, giving Jo all of the early work so that she could do it when she was fresh.
Well, there were several scenes of you in bed. Come on.
Those were some of the things we shot.
It's very hard work being in bed.
We don't have any additional questions. I'm going to call moderator's prerogative and ask a question myself. And I guess I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about storytelling and the extent to which the stories that we tell are gendered. You know, we are used to certain characters and certain tropes and certain structures that, you know, we've learned and we've carried through from classical literature and classical plays. And so I guess I'm interested in how easy is it to start writing new stories, but knowing that we need stories that we also recognise some of the rhythms of them so that we find our way into them and so can hear new voices and new people. So how do we balance those things?
Oh, that's very difficult.
Yeah, I know. I thought I'd go from bloopers to a discussion around about how we can.
I'm just sort of thinking about how the Gospel according to Jesus, Queen of Heaven, did that. It just took somebody that everybody assumed was male and turned her into a trans woman, and that freaked out many people. But what a powerful thing that was to do. I was also thinking about Elaine talking about how she structured the film script. I was terribly impressed by that. I can't do that. My plays are, I disobey all the rules. I've never been able to write a naturalistic play, for instance, never in my life. I always think that, and it does occur to me that the forms that we use, the traditional forms that we use, really do reflect a cis heteronormative view of the world, and to manage to follow those norms and yet create something that is new and subversive, I think that's a remarkable achievement that I just can't do. And the older I get, the less I can do it. But I do other things. So that all the plays I've written since transitioning, since beginning to live as a woman, have actually been pretty far out in terms of their form and their structure, because we have to have new structures. We have to have new artistic structures to help imagine, to help create and help dream a new reality into being. I like to think of my scripts as post-capitalist.
Thank God.
That's what I think they are, and I think they are in the sense that they're not about conflict. They're not about individuals. They're not about dissolution and clashes and all that. They're about trying to find wholeness. I've just been working on a new script called Slug Love, which is all about two slugs making love, because slugs, as we know, are. I was told, we still get called a lot we're unnatural, don't we?
Yeah.
And I get called unnatural because I have breasts and I still have my little penis, and I never actually went. Here am I disclosing intimate details about myself. It's kind of important. But the slugs, who I love dearly, actually, I've really got into slugs. My daughter sent me a picture of a huge leopard slug or a tiger slug that was in her garden. And she said, "Dad, you've got to watch how these slugs make love." And it's amazing. I do recommend you watch it. And they have, they wouldn't call them penises, but their sexual organs come out from behind their ear when they're aroused. And they intertwine their bodies when they start making love, and then these extraordinary things come out of their ear. And they intertwine and they form a beautiful, beautiful flower-like shape. And their sexual organs both discharge and receive. They are perfect hermaphrodites. And that's I don't know why I'm telling you about this, but I think it's important. It's we have to understand that there are possibilities in life and there are possibilities in nature that, wow, heteronormative life culture knows nothing about. It's wonderful.
That biology lesson in Elaine's next film is going to look very different. Elaine, do you have something to add to that around storytelling? No, okay, sorry. No, okay, I thought you had your hand up. I wonder if our lecturers could comment on storytelling as well, and the way that we transmit information to students about films and the way films tell stories, and whether that needs to change in teaching practice.
Yeah, sure. I can come out from a sort of film theory and history side, and Andrew from a film practice side. Certainly this week, actually, in our Hollywood module, we've got a week on queer cinema that my colleague Stephanie is teaching. And similar to as Joe was discussing there and David intimated, the kind of new queer cinema movement from the early 1990s, a term coined by B. Ruby Rich, ripped up those conventional storytelling modes and said we not only have to represent queer identities on the screen, but we have to queer those modes of representation themselves. And they made very provocative and interesting and political films that many people liked. They also made films that many people didn't like and found difficult to get on with. And, you know, as we've discussed earlier, you know, representation is such a charged term, and everybody finds, you know, their identities represented in different ways, and many in the LGBT community didn't gel with those films, and many did. So, you know, there have been those movements throughout film history to really radically rip up conventional storytelling forms, and they worked for some people and they didn't work for other people. So, you know, I think it's having the plurality available to audiences, and sometimes audiences have less of the radical forms available for them to access and to watch, and that's a problem in terms of distribution and who controls what gets seen. But yeah, certainly it's something that cinema has grappled with throughout its history.
From a more production side of things, I'll try and chime in. When I'm teaching my undergrads who are into story writing, one of the first things I sometimes recommend is that they take something that already exists, such as the damsel in distress, and they subvert it. So I think that's coming back to even something that Joe was speaking about, is we need new structures in order to tell new stories, but oftentimes failing that, if we take a familiar structure or familiar tropes and change them or subvert them, or make a love story about slugs, this can be just as effective at sort of catalyzing new storytelling and new representations being exposed. And oftentimes we do see creative things from the undergrads and how they take a familiar concept and change it. But on the flip side of that, I think in terms of approach to writing, I've certainly worked with a couple of writers in the past who, when writing a story, they do not assign genders to their characters. Some of them go as far not to assign names as well, because they have to ask themselves, at what point does gender become important or not? And certainly there's a place for telling those authentic stories about gender experience, but there's also a place for saying, well, maybe my main character, the swashbuckling pirate, doesn't need to be handsome, dashing, mustached man. Maybe that comes down to a decision with casting or much later down the line. So an approach of subversion as well as being open-minded, I think, is key in the classroom and outside of it.
Thank you, Andrew.
I'm out of questions,
Yeah.
but just a comment there, just complimenting Shan as the hostess, indeed with the mostess, and passing on thanks to you for your sharing there.
And on that note, I would like to wrap up the evening. So I'd like to say thank you so much to Joe and to Emily and to Elaine for coming out here, and it's a real privilege to hear your stories, and you've given us, I know you've given us so much of yourself, and I'm not going to underestimate the amount of you that you've given to this evening, not just in your creative work, but in your reflections. And I think that's really important to note. And also to thank Rob and Andrew for the way that they've critically reflected upon the films and given their perspectives on trans representation and trans identities in the film industry. So I'd like to thank everybody. I know we would normally have a big round of applause at this point, but I am very, very thankful to everybody who's been a part of this, and not least to Callum, who's been behind the scenes the whole time, switching the screens, and to David, who's been reading out all the questions as well. So we're going to leave the evening there, but thank you very, very much for joining us. Yes.